Thank you all for being here. I'm very excited for this conversation, and we have three excellent speakers, luminaries in their field, here to talk about the nature of how these spaces that we've spent so much time considering art, both past, present, and future, is evolving in a changing world and a changing landscape for museums. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Kaywin Feldman, the director of the National Gallery of Art. Mariette Westerman, the Vice Chancellor, NYU Abu Dhabi, the Director and CEO-elect of the Solomon Guggenheim Museum and Foundation, and Manuel Rabate, Director of the Louvre Abu Dhabi. Excellent. So it's wonderful to be here with you all. And I think you each have such unique experiences and also such unique institutions, how they operate globally, how they operate both in a local context, and then see their place in the world, I think is something each of you consider very deeply with these different institutions. But I think this conversation has been especially pointed here in Abu Dhabi as we've watched the development of this space of the Louvre Abu Dhabi being built, and how this collection has been continuing to be added to and continues to unfold, and how it continues to think of itself. I feel like, as you've said many times, the Louvre Abu Dhabi developed in a way that was very much considering Abu Dhabi's place in the world as a hub for global culture, but also how this museum was looking at, basically charting the entire history of art, in a way, and the history of human civilization. So tell me about the way that, well, if we start here locally before we bring in the voices from the international institutions, tell me about the way that you started thinking about how you were going to develop this collection and why you felt that an impermanent collection was the best way to tackle it, a collection that could ebb and flow and relied very heavily on long-term loans and interconnected relationships with other institutions, both the Louvre in Paris as well as many others that you've dealt with.
Thanks, William. First, I would like to say that I'm very pleased to be here in the Cultural Summit, and we had some very incredible examples of the vitality of the scene. And Louvre Abu Dhabi is not born in a vacuum. And I want to say a few words of congratulations for my dear colleagues of the Department of Culture and Tourism organizing that, because you see the strengths of this gathering, of these exchanges, and this is definitely this maelstrom which is creating the energy of cultural institution in Abu Dhabi. Louvre Abu Dhabi is a very specific museum which is part of this very integrated strategy, the core being inside the art cultural district. It is the reinvention of the Universal Museum. So we are putting ourselves in the long history of the Universal Museum, and this is what the first part of the name Louvre means, these encyclopedic museums which are gathering knowledge on artworks from all over the world. But when you put together Louvre and Abu Dhabi, you get a fantastic opportunity to write a new chapter of the encyclopedic Universal Museum. Maybe beyond the encyclopedic approach, which is categorizing knowledge by specificity, Egyptian art, Dutch painting, or materiality, sculpture, drawings, but by insisting on what is Abu Dhabi, which is a place of connection, a hub of the world. So Louvre Abu Dhabi, the capital city of this emirate, means the new Universal Museum which is connecting culture. So indeed, we had this opportunity to tell the story of the world in a connected way. So basically, for those who have not visited, it's like a time machine. You start at the Neolithic Revolution and you finish today. And in each room, you have artworks from all civilizations. This is where I get to your question. To be able to tell this story, it is very important to have key artworks. So what we have done was, of course, at the beginning, thanks to the relationship between France and Abu Dhabi, we managed to get the best of all the French collections, the Louvre, of course, but also the Musée d'Orsay, Centre Pompidou, Musée Guimet, Musée du Quai Branly, Versailles, all the museums that have been gathered around us to help us build this universal narrative. But in parallel to these fantastic loans, we have grown the collection of the Louvre Abu Dhabi, which is owned by Abu Dhabi government. And in the galleries, what you see is objects from both sources. What we have added, and maybe we'll get back to that, is artworks which are also coming from, I would say, other type of relationship. We worked a lot with the Arab world, with Oman, with the Kingdom of Saudi, with of course all the Emirates, with Jordan, and we have these artworks which are also from the region, rooting this universal story in our territories. And while we're evolving, the French loans are, it was part of the project, they are going down, the collection going up, but we also have this new relationship which are providing new artworks which are also being developed.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I feel, each of you, both of you, if we're looking at, how things operate within a space, how things operate within a culture, we're also operating in changing cultures, in changing demographics, changing perspectives. Like both of you are historic appointments and the first women to hold your respective roles, which is incredibly important. You need to, and these things need to be considered. And I know, Kay, when looking at how the National Gallery of Art, you've been in this job, I think 4 years?
5.
5 years, 5 years. Time flies. What year were we? 2024, right? Anyway. But if we're looking at how you've tackled this role, I know you're thinking very carefully about this being, the reflection of this country and the way that this country, we're going to have a demographic change by, I think, 2046 of what even the multicultural face of this country looks like in terms of, majority populations. As well, you've always, I think, going back to your how these collections evolve and how you're looking at, having conversations with other institutions in answering those questions, in responding to the time and being a nimble institution while also being one of, I guess, grounded cultural standing.
Thank you, and I'm delighted to be here and grateful to the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this. The National Gallery was founded in 1937 by a single person, Andrew Mellon, who wrote a letter to President Roosevelt offering to give the money to build a building and his collection if the U.S. government would agree to fund the museum in perpetuity as a world-class museum. So it's a relatively rare origin story for a national museum to be founded by a single person. And I often think back that when Andrew Mellon gave his gift in 1941, when we opened in 1941, that his collection was mostly European. A few American works snuck in sort of towards the end, and in 1941, the United States was 91% white. And so Andrew Mellon's idea of culture was Europe. Beginning and end, it was Europe. And then what we collected in American art was really American art that followed the European tradition. And then when his son, Paul Mellon, opened the East Building, which he and his sister supported, he said that it was his father's vision and it's theirs that the National Gallery would always be a changing institution, evolving in its benefit to artists, scholars, and the public. And so, in my work there, I've been thinking about our origin, about our and that's separate from immigration. That's pure demographics of Americans today. And so I feel that to fulfill the vision of Andrew and Paul Mellon and of the many Americans who fund the National Gallery, that it is an exciting opportunity for us to truly reflect the nation. And that means a lot of change at the National Gallery because, like lots of museums, our collection is the artists in our collection are 91% white male artists. And it will take us years and years and years to sort of change that. And the truth is that at the end of the day, it's about being representative of all people. So we continue to honor our extraordinary European collections. We are completely devoted, both in the collection and in our programming, to the work of old master European artists as much as we think about Americans today. So, you know, I think in our polarized world, everybody wants to believe that something is either or, that you can't be many things, that it has to be one or the other, and we really see a plurality across the spectrum.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and Harriet as well. I mean, if we listed, you know, the hats that you've worn over the years, we probably would run out of time. But you've always had, you know, fine art as a basis of your being, and so I feel like taking on the Guggenheim Foundation globally, there's a lot to consider there. But you've always kind of considered all of these different global views through the nature of the way that you've approached your career. So if you could walk me through, as you're coming into this position of the Guggenheim, how you've been looking at, you know, what the Guggenheim means in the current moment, in the current time, and what the different reflections of it across the world mean, and how you're thinking about that in terms of building the collection moving forward.
William, thank you very much for that question. I too want to take the opportunity to compliment the Department of Culture and Tourism and congratulate them on the staggering success, growing success of the Culture Summit ever since 2017. It's amazing to have so many of you from around the world with us in our wonderful crossroads city. And of course, DCT, long having been a partner for me in my roles at NYO Abu Dhabi, I'm really delighted to become an even stronger partner as I come into this role. So here comes the disclaimer that I have the opportunity to make, which is that I haven't started yet, which is a great and luxurious position from which to talk about museums. But of course, I've long thought about museums. I'm thrilled to be here with Kevin and Manuel, both fellow travelers and friends of very, very long years. And of course, in my role, one of my roles was working for a foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And in that role, funding arts and culture, often I found myself in a position that I didn't really relish, but it really was a position to ask museum directors to do more, to step forward and be more relevant to their societies, even if that was especially hard if one came from a historical collection in the way that the Louvre in Paris has been and that the National Gallery of Art have been. And now I'm up against it. I've stepped in and I said I'll do it. And what I want to say about your question about the Guggenheim today and the Guggenheim past and future is that what excited me about joining is that it is a museum resolutely dedicated to modern and contemporary art. And in the context of this question of collections, which is at the core of our session, I believe, it is often said that it's often asked about museums of modern and contemporary art. How should they collect? Should they collect at all? Where should their collecting begin? Where should it end? You can ask the directors of MoMA, of the Whitney, of the Guggenheim for that matter. Where do people come down on that? The great thing, and one real motivation for me to join the global Guggenheim constellation of our museums, the Frank Lloyd Wright Building in New York, the Peggy Guggenheim Collection in Venice, Guggenheim Bilbao, and now this magnificent Guggenheim Museum Abu Dhabi that you see rising very fast. If you haven't seen it yet, go look at it. It's getting there. What's so exciting about the foundation, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation, and the museums it has spawned and overseen, is that it was always grounded in the idea that the art of today should be collected and preserved. And so that means that artists have always been core to it. Our original collections that Solomon R. Guggenheim and Hilla Ribe, who actually was the first woman director of at least one of the pieces of the institution, the Museum of Non-Objective Art that became the Guggenheim Museum in New York, what the two of them decided was to bring the art that was then barely known in the United States, Kandinsky, Paul Klee, Brock, all these wonderful, still living artists, to collect them and bring them into public view, not just to display them, as many museums of contemporary art do, but also to take on the responsibility to preserve, to study them, to make them better known over time, so that in the future, when that art would have become historical, it could still mean something to us today. And every one of our Guggenheim museums today represents that view. And when you take that attitude, you don't have to ask, should we stop collecting at Van Gogh? Should we stop with Picasso? Should we stop with Jenny Holzer? You just have to keep going. And I think that's very beautiful and relevant, especially in a global crossroads like this, when so many of our conversations are about what can a museum still mean in a post-colonial moment that we hope is truly post-colonial. Because, of course, art today, with the massive movements and disruptions of globalization that we've seen, the wonderful thing about some of those disruptions is the total visibility or increasing visibility across borders, that great art has always been made everywhere, and that continues today.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, I mean, going to your point, I mean, if we're thinking about the art of sharing, tell me about the sort of, what are conversations like behind the scenes between your institutions in terms of thinking about, yes, how we are responding to this moment, how we are responding to an increasingly globalized world and an increasingly decolonialized world, and how we can best aid each other in terms of, creating both a a proper identity for each institution, while also making sure that there is a proper exchange. Like, at the end of the day, is preservation a matter of ownership, or is it something deeper? Is it something that exists between us rather than in any individual space? If anyone wants to jump in with that.
I'll start. I do believe that specifically, or particularly in America, that we are still operating, perhaps transitioning, but operating in the 20th century world of museums. The 20th century was the great era of museum boom in the United States. American cities, as they developed, again, looked to Europe and emulated and decided that they needed a library, a zoo, an orchestra, and an art museum to be a civilized society. And so the 20th century for American museums was the era of growth. Everything we did was all about being measured on doing more, adding more works of art to the collection, building bigger buildings to show the works of the collection, adding staff. And when I look at the growth that the institutions I've run in my career have enjoyed under my predecessors, it's extraordinary. They've gone from very small institutions to very large and complicated institutions. And I truly believe that it is time to stop measuring museum success exclusively in growth terms, and that it is time to think about what the new 21st century paradigm is. And it reflects now to your question, and I think that a big part of this new paradigm needs to be sharing our assets together, sharing our collections, our expertise, our resources. And I think it makes sense for lots of reasons, economic as well as sustainability. And we haven't quite figured out what that means yet, but I think it's time for this new paradigm. And the idea that we have to own everything is a 20th century mentality, and I'm really excited about embracing a new 21st century mentality.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I feel, I guess a lot of times you can think of a lot of these big institutions, especially ones with a history like this, like it's the ending scene of Indiana Jones, like certain things are just being shoved into a warehouse somewhere and never really having the chance for the world to see them. And so one of the great things about, maybe the Louvre Abu Dhabi existing is that it can take certain things that maybe weren't getting the spotlight, and being able to not only put the spotlight on them, but put it in a different sort of context in order to put it against work that helps tell a grander story of the development of art, rather than just being like, here is a piece that previously maybe not have gotten the shine that it might have deserved.
I think that what we do at Louvre Abu Dhabi, which is thanks to the opportunity of being a new museum. We opened 6 years ago, so we could really use the blocks and push or propose a new narrative. It's instead of having indeed maybe too Western focus, that would be from the Egyptian to the Greek to the Roman to the Middle Ages to Renaissance and then to abstraction. I'm oversimplifying, but this very linear historical trend that is of course a reality of sequence, but not the only explanation of history of art. Because from the beginning, while keeping the chronological order, we show all the connection and all the cross exchanges that you have. You have the same factual evolution of time. You have the same impact of anthropological changes, mechanical, print, photography, which of course have an impact. And so the history of art can be put in a certain order. Because this is a reality of time and its connection. But what we are able to show is that at every age, at every moment, what are the influences, what are the connections, how the culture can get inspired by one another, what are the traveling of the workshop, what are the people who get... and this is actually a new way of telling a connected history of art. And I think that most of the main museums having this kind of collection are questioning that on the intersection or by trying to reinterrogate their own collection. I'm sure this is what you're doing, to give new angles and so on. In our case, and it's because we're new, we are able to start with that and to offer this different gaze on the collection, on the connection as a starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's also a matter of, you know, not only staying relevant to the current moment, but also being able to predict where things are going. Because you're not making these choices for the next 3 months. It's not just a specific exhibit as well. So you also have to think, you know, what's going to still be a matter, what's going to make this valuable moving forward, and how are we going to be able to build off those choices as well. So there's a bit of projection in that as well.
No, but when you're putting two archaeological, beautiful objects used to weight, one from China, one from France, in the same showcase, when you are putting various first representation of the body in all over the world, when you are having all the connection routes through objects, you really get the capacity to understand either the anthropological traits that connect us, or the real roots of inspiration, and like this huge showcase that we have, starting with the Tang in China up to the Western world, of course crossing this region of the world, showing how, showing with object this connection, this traveling patterns and art, and this is in a globalized world, which is more and more complex, in which the multiplication of image is in a way blurring our capacity to assess and to understand and to decode what we have. Sometimes in the museum, and I think that's something as a civic space, as a space of learning, as a space of maybe slowing down sometimes, we are offering through objects the capacity to decipher the image.
And what do you see as the role of an institution, because obviously having worked across many and now coming in very philosophically, okay, how am I going to do this? In terms of responding to the current moment, and responding to a cultural, political context of conversation, of things, and making sure that that perspective is able to, I guess, encompass the different perspectives of many different voices.
This is, I think, where the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi has such a great opportunity, and therefore the Guggenheim has such a great opportunity to be changed by what happens here. Just as Guggenheim Bilbao changed us in New York back in the day and made us truly international, beyond even Venice, which was already in our purview. And I have a strong sense of this because of helping build and lead NYO Abu Dhabi over the years. Our university reflects the fact that this country is home to people from more than 200 countries, nationalities, many language communities, faiths are welcome here. People of all sorts are welcome here. And you see it here. If you go beyond Saadiyat, you'll see it all everywhere in the country as well. And so when you think about representing art from all continents, to be sure. I think even Antarctica, if we work at it hard enough, will be in there. But we have that opportunity really to look to the global south, to South Asia, to Africa, to Europe, to the Pacific, to all parts of the world, indigenous communities as well as historically formalized academies of art and things like that. We can really look out everywhere and work with these communities, not just to take the art and put it here, but work with the artists, the curators, the people who have been supporting artists around the world over time, just in the same way that they will, and in that way they will have a real reception here, because there are people here from everywhere who come for the weather. What's not to like about the weather, huh? In February, March, pretty good. But also people who've decided to make their lives here in the Gulf or specifically in the UAE. So I think this is where collecting still is important. I completely agree with both of my colleagues that we have been shifting and should be shifting from an age of collecting, building primarily and ownership into sharing. I don't think collecting and sharing are counterintuitive. Museums and collectors have always shared what they have. We just need to do more of it, and we need to diversify these collections, because if we stop collecting now, the collections will always have these strong European and Western biases that Kevin spoke about. So I think that is a real opportunity, and therein lies the opportunity to stay relevant and to be part of these conversations. I know, and it's the last thing I'll say for a second, I know that all museums struggle with that question about how do we deal with the communities asking us to stand for something, to do this or say that and so forth, which is not really primarily our role. But we can be places where these conversations can happen, because art expresses the views of people one way or another, directly of artists or of cultures or even of political moments. And therefore I think on the whole, museums can be grateful, in fact, that we are places where people want to come, and that these places, that communities also want to hold us accountable to some degree.
No, I think one of the fascinating things about what each of you do is that I think maybe there's a misconception sometimes that museums might, okay, if we're looking at modern art, for example, or classic, if we're looking at different eras, we kind of see them as static, like that's built, like this, okay, if we're looking at this era, that's the Mona Lisa, okay, let's move on, what is this? I mean, you see what I mean? But constantly we are going back, and I think you guys are going back, to certain eras and saying, how can we look that differently? Have we completely understood the past correctly? What does the past look like reflecting this current moment and how we got to where we are, and maybe didn't look at the past in a correct way? This is something you've done before, looking at, okay, if we're looking at Native American indigenous art, why have we never looked at that from a female perspective? When throughout history, that was from a female perspective, we're calling it that. So what happens if we amplify that? So, and as well, if we're looking at the way that different institutions maybe will say, okay, does this piece belong here? Does it belong in this location? Should this be, if this has a greater history in the Middle East, should it be, at the Guggenheim, for example? Is that better place than Bilbao? And you can kind of have those sorts of conversations and look at these sorts of things. So tell me about the way that you are implementing that sort of mentality in recontextualizing your current collections and in those conversations having exchanges.
Yeah. At the National Gallery, we're just embarked on a process of rethinking our collection and launching a new installation of the permanent collection, which is a big, ambitious project, and we're taking it slowly. And I've said to the team that if I want to take everything out and put it on the lawn and then put it back in again, and if we put it back in the same way, that's okay. It's about the intellectual exercise of thinking about how we see our collections. And as part of that, thinking about the fit into those blocks so conveniently as we have organized them. Art is messy because people are messy. So we're thinking about maybe loosening up some of those boundaries that we've created over time, as well as chronological boundaries. And like so many museums, we've been experimenting with putting the occasional work of contemporary art in a historic gallery, which I love doing. I think the key is to do it judiciously. If you do it too much, then it becomes sort of formulaic. But I've noticed both in Minneapolis and in Washington that when you do that, visitors who after 2 hours in a museum, you can see the haze comes over their eyes and their feet hurt, and you can tell they're just sort of, they're marching through to do the museum. And but when they come into a room with perhaps a contemporary work hung in a historic collection, they stop. And even a first-time museum goer, they can tell something's different in there. And they want to know what we're up to. And so it's the moment of surprise, and then they look carefully at the contemporary work, they look at the historic work, they read the labels, and I think it's one of the greatest successes I've seen, because it gets people really, really, looking and thinking and trying to understand. So I think there's lots of new strategies that we're all looking at to encourage people to come and look again. And I think we've trained people along the idea of museum visiting as consumption. I mentioned the do. I always cringe when people say, I've done the Uffizi, I've done the Met, as though a single visit could ever satisfy so many avenues, and sort of transitioning from the idea that you can and then the faience hippo on that smooth surface. I just loved it. It was a moment for a smile, and I thought, shout out to that curator for a little bit of humor and levity. And I think that moments like that get us all looking more closely at collections.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's so much profundity and juxtaposition in positioning. And there's so many times, I can remember going to museums and how much you're not able to maybe take anything in just because of how things are positioned. It's mentally overwhelming. So you have to be thinking so much about, how do I amplify this work in the most effective way? How do I make sure that these things are in conversation with each other in the most effective way, which is something that the Louvre has been key to prioritize from the start.
I would really say on this one, to go back to your previous questions on our model is highly dynamic, and we coined the semi-permanent approach for the permanent galleries, because by design the loans from the French Museum are moving all the time. And for instance, the Leonardo, the wonderful St. John the Baptist, which is, that was our birthday gift loan for 2 years. You're able in the art of Abu Dhabi to enjoy this exquisite, absolutely key artwork by Leonardo in this place, and then it will go back to the Louvre, and then we will have something else, and we'll keep on having artworks that will be on loan. Same thing for some of the Chinese beautiful loans from Musée Guimet. We have them. The little blue lady came on. That's part of the. So when you're coming back, you will see elements. At the same time, it's semi-permanent, because we believe that it makes sense also to have a backbone, which is the collection. And this is what Mariette said, and I completely back a pledge of the necessity to keep on acquiring. A museum needs to develop its identity, its DNA through its collection, because they are the things that you will see, which can be in a dynamic display in the galleries. There is also the identity and the curators, the research, and everything that we do on the objects that we know. Owning the object, having them on our inventory, doesn't mean that they're not there for the world. In our cases, if we are very used to receive artworks from all the French museums, from all our partners in the region, and Korea, Philippines, and so on. But we are also lending. We started a partnership with Oman. We received many, I think the third time that we're doing rotation of beautiful artworks from the Omani heritage and from the museum in Muscat. But our collection of Iznik also went there for a special exhibition, and that was a way for Louvre Abu Dhabi to be in Muscat. Our K-bot is offered to the public today, but enjoy now, because it's going for a few months in a trip in the world, and that's going to be a great moment for Louvre Abu Dhabi staff also to create new connection with our colleagues all over the world. So we are sharing objects, we're sharing them with our visitors, but we're also sharing them with sisters institutions, and I think it's also our mission to be connected with the world.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if we're looking, both at the Guggenheim globally and the Guggenheim locally, in the way that you're thinking about, as we were saying, working with local partners in order to recontextualize this sort of history, what do you say is your guiding light in terms of the way that you're approaching those conversations and how that's affected? Obviously, yes, you're still to join, but in terms of how you're thinking about how the future of these things are going to evolve from the institution's perspective.
Well, I have been thinking a lot about it and enjoying it, and of course visited all the beautiful sites again. I had done so in the past. I would say that the Guggenheim, compared to the two universalizing institutions that are here represented by my friends, has two distinct advantages. One of them actually grows out of a constraint. We don't have a comprehensive collection of anything. We are a collection of what was the contemporary, growing forward, and staying contemporary. And therefore, and we don't have a gigantic museum in New York. Our founding museum, the Frank Lloyd Wright building, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum that opened in 1959, is wonderfully fluid. You constantly can reinstall it going down the spiral in any which way you want, but we never had a gigantic permanent collection to display, even though our collection is certainly large these days. And so these brilliant curators we have, and we can do anything from creating single artist shows like Christopher Wool or Sarah C. or Alex Katz, or the brilliant show of historical show of Hilda af Klint that my predecessor Richard Armstrong had the genius to create, going back to an early history in modernism where women's roles were really sort of ignored a little bit, and the spiritual in art was ignored, even though Kandinsky was all about the spiritual in art. So we can do these restagings all the time, and that is an advantage of having a space constraint. I know that probably most curators don't like to hear that, but there is an advantage because there's a discipline in what you can do and how you can stage these interventions. The second advantage the Guggenheim has is that we are truly a global and local institution now by design. We have 3 sites, soon to be 4, and already we lend all the time and create exhibitions together in a very vigorous way between New York, Venice, and of American pop art in Bilbao. And when you first hear that, you might say, American pop art? Is there anything more to say? Didn't everybody know this already? Well, as we know, American pop art is large. We can't necessarily show that much of it all the time in New York or Venice. But it actually turns out that when you stage it in a different setting in the Basque Country, as we now have, first of all, our curators get to look at it all over again incorporate the knowledge that has been brought forth in recent decades, ever since Warhol's death, you could say, since Lichtenstein's death, on these very important, innovative artists. We have more women represented in that show than would have been in the past. And we've brought in the curators have brought in contemporary responses of the last 10 years or so. So there's always an opportunity to make things new, which is core to the Guggenheim Museum, especially because we can do it in other sites where you can open up in a way that you've described for the Louvre, Abu Dhabi, in relation to the mothership Louvre.
Absolutely. I wanted to open the space if we have any questions from the audience, because we have just a few minutes left, so maybe we can get a couple of questions in as well. Anyone else over here? Can we get a microphone?
Michael?
Please. Sure, I'll repeat it for everyone.
As we've seen here at the summit, culture is a partnership between the creator and the audience and the receiver. In traditional museums, historically, the paintings just hung there and people came and seen. But now with technology and a whole new approach, it's the museum that's having a dialogue with the audience. And could you just talk a little bit about how you're using new technologies and your approach of communicating with the visitors who range from people who are very expert and nuanced and people who are totally ignorant like me?
Whoever would like to jump in.
Please.
I think that so many museums now are experimenting with this three-way conversation with the artist or artists, the institution, and community. And we haven't spoken a lot about community yet, but I think the ways that museums have really turned their focus from an earlier period of such focus on scholars and artists and sort of art enthusiasts to understanding the context of the place they're in is really exciting. And so many museums are experimenting, for example, with comment boards at the end of exhibitions where visitors can write their thoughts and ideas. And I recommend everybody to stop and read those comments. You can often learn more about an exhibition and its impact and meaning from the thoughts of the visitors along the journey. So there's also museums in America frequently work with community advisory groups and coming together often with the artist present if they're living, and work together on some of the interpretation of the exhibition, of the permanent collection as well, and thinking about programming. And I think that collaboration, it's very new for museums because it is about shared authority, this idea that, the curator still has the idea for the show and the curatorial integrity, but that you can also make the installation or exhibition even stronger by including outside voices.
Our game show noise that we have 5 minutes left. But please continue, sorry.
Did I win something?
Yeah.
You're not being played off the stage, don't worry. This isn't the Oscars, that's next week.
Okay. Michael, I think we discussed that several times, but I'm inspired by Walter Benjamin in the sense that I really think the aura of the original object is the core of what our museum of object of materiality are. I think in our case, being a museum telling the connected history of art of the world, we use technology to tell more stories, to give more depth, to give more discovery, more knowledge, more education when we can. Mariette mentioned 200 nationalities living there. It's the same thing with tourism and resident and tourists speak so many languages. So how can we speak all the languages of the world without having too much things printed? And how can we? Technology is a great thing with our app, which is fantastic. You just need to scan the artwork. You don't need to type anything, and you can have the labels in the language which is the closest to you. We have visits which are timed to the average time of visit, which are purely musical, inspired by the theme of the collection. We have podcast made by Emirati storyteller, inspired by the artwork that you can. So technology is a fantastic tool enhancing the storytelling, and when it's not in confrontation with the artworks, but in amplification of the experience, I think we have limitless opportunities, and we have experienced some of them at Louvre Abu Dhabi with a great success and great, let's say, engagement from people from all over the world, and also from the land.
Yeah, I would say that probably from my observation and service on museum boards, I think for a long time museums thought of the digital as a way to expand their audience coming to the museum. Get more feet in the door, it's important. The gate's important for us. Publicize what you're doing, advertising, visitor services, and so forth. And I think the next level that the colleagues here have talked about is making sure that anyone, anywhere on Earth who has a good and solid Wi-Fi connection can benefit from the resources that we as institutions in the public service, ultimately whether we're private or public, we're all in the public service, preserving and transmitting and making community cultural conversations possible. It is our job to figure out the best way to do that so that anyone who visits us as a user, as a museum user, comes to us online, has an equivalently great experience of the offer we have on the inside and in our places. It's a real challenge, but I think it's very exciting, and obviously the technological innovations that we're seeing at Meta, at OpenAI, are probably going to make a lot possible. It will be chaotic for a little while, but that's all right. We need to find a way through it, and our institutions are in a way structured and set up to bring sense and possibility in sort of a disciplined and structured way to those options and potentials.
Absolutely, absolutely. We only have about a minute left, so I don't think we'll have time for another question, unfortunately, because we have to wrap right on time. Very quick. Sure.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I have a question especially addressed to for the Guggenheim. Are you going to have a special section addressed to the new generations? Because Louvre has a children's space specifically designed for them, but what about the Guggenheim? Have you thought about going towards the new generations?
I've thought about it a lot. Watch this space. But I can say that as an educator, I'm also an educator, of course, as apart from being an art historian and a university leader, I'm with young people all the time. This is one of the great things. The great things about working with a university is that you have 18 to 22-year-olds and even much younger high school students who come with us, and they let you know precisely what they want and what they think you should do. And so I'm thinking about it a lot, and you can be sure that education, but really community engagement and creating a platform for young people to come, obviously this is going to have a significant role in any museum today, and it's very exciting to be able to build new museums as we've been doing.
And
thank you.
the full museum is for young people. Mm-hmm. There are spaces when we can craft special strategies, but the full museum is for the new generation. It's about transmission, and we play a lot with gamification in Louvre Abu Dhabi, and we're about to launch a location-based game, which is a way to go with the family to look at the artworks. But the museum is for everyone, and it includes the family and the youth. Thanks.
Excellent.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh. My name is William Mullally, Arts and Culture Editor for The National, and thank you so much to my speakers, Kevin, Harriet, Manuel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.